us for bill introductions. I know we must be late because the vice chair is here, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to have an overview of, that's fine, property tax in the Constitution, Amelia. This is going to help answer some questions. People there seems to be some issues. They think we can do whatever we want, but we do have restrictions within our state constitution. So thank you, Amelia.
See that it's broken up into kind of a couple little sections. The Kansas Constitution, Article 11, Article 11, we'll go through those, and then a couple miscellaneous provisions relating to permanent tax levies authority. The Kansas Constitution, Article 11, is titled Finance and Taxation. And this particular article governs property tax. And well, let's start with Section 1 of Article 11. Section 1 of Article 11, which you can find a complete copy of Section 1 attached to the back of your memo today, provides a framework that actually has multiple purposes in the realm of property tax. It addresses valuation, rate of taxation, classification, as well as exemptions. The first topic of my presentation today is uniformity and equality as it relates to property tax. And the provision that you should note that is in Section 1 near the beginning is that it provides that except as otherwise hereinafter specifically provided, the legislature shall provide for a uniform and equal basis of valuation and rate of taxation of all property subject to taxation. So we kind of generally refer that to as our uniformity and equality requirement, but it is very specific. It relates to both valuation and rate of taxation for all property subject to taxation. Now, if you back up at the beginning, the clause before that does provide for exceptions in the Constitution. And there are some exceptions in the Constitution. Notably for real property, that would be our ag use properties. Land devoted to agricultural use is allowed to have a different basis of valuation. And some other examples in the personal property realm include our commercial and industrial machinery and equipment. Watercraft could have a different basis of valuation. So there are some exceptions, motor vehicles. So there are some exceptions listed in the Constitution. To satisfy the constitutional uniform and equal requirements, the legislature has statutorily provided that all taxable property be listed and valued annually as of January 1st at its fair market value, except for those constitutionally accepted items such as land devoted ag use and motor vehicles and CIME, those types of things. I've listed some statutes for you, I believe, on the second page relating to that. As part of this uniform and equal process, the legislature has also provided statutes that provide for that uniformity, not only the fair market value standard, but also within the process. So it's on as of January 1. That's a uniform date of valuation. And you will see KSA 79503A on, I believe I may have it. Well, we'll get there in a minute. But relating back to uniformity and equality, there's a couple notes that I want to point out. There's case law that has interpreted this provision over many, many years, since we've had this in our Constitution, which uniformity and equality, at least a provision, not this exact provision, has been in our Constitution since our inception. But the power of taxation is a legislative function. So that's where we get the general, the authority lies with the legislature within the confines of what the Constitution provides. And so the Kansas Supreme Court has repeatedly found that well, I'm off slightly, has found that the legislature has pretty broad authority, but it is limited within that uniform and equal provision. The Supreme Court has found that this uniformity requires uniformity in the basis of assessment as well as the rate of taxation, and that that this is virtually identical to the protection that's granted in the Equal Protection Clause. So sometimes equal protection also comes into play. When we think about uniformity, let's see. When we think about uniformity, we go back to the definition of fair market value, and fair market value has been defined in statute as the amount of terms in money that a well-informed buyer is justified in paying and a well-informed seller is justified in accepting for property in an open and competitive market, assuming that the parties are acting without undue compulsion. That statute, 79503A, also provides a list of factors to be considered, and those factors kind of go along with the three approaches to value that you're used to seeing: the cost approach, the sales comparison approach, and the income capitalization approach, which are kind of the standard property appraisal methodologies. As I noted, the basis of valuation selected by the legislature is fair market value. When you actually read the constitutional provision, Section 1 of Article 11, it merely provides that the legislature provide a uniform method of valuation. It doesn't actually use the terms fair market value. That is found in Kansas statute as adopted by the legislature. The important part, though, is that when the proper courts have looked at this, because there have been obviously over time a lot of legislation that may deviate from this fair market value standard. And the proper test for determining whether a valuation statute conforms to this constitutional mandate is to determine whether the special treatment provided to whatever that legislation provides the special treatment for, whether that group of property, whether the special treatment given to that group of property bears a reasonable relationship to the actual fair market value of the property. There is guidance in several different types of cases about this. Most recently, there was a case, the Board of Johnson County Commissioners versus Jordan, which the issue was a statute that was amended, I believe, in 2014 that provided, in a general sense, it provided for the county appraiser to essentially maintain a valuation if it was lowered after the appeals process, to maintain that value for a property for the following year. It was originally the statute was to maintain that value for the following tax year unless there were substantial and compelling reasons to increase the value. The legislature in 2014 actually extended that to maintaining the value for 2 years and also defined what substantial and compelling reasons were. And the court looked at that definition and looked at the statutory instruction and actually found that what would happen under those provisions is that we would have one group of property that would not be valued at fair market value. That the way they defined substantial and compelling wouldn't allow some properties to be valued at fair market value, and it did find that particular provision of the statute unconstitutional. It did sever that portion from the rest of the statute. There was much more in the statute that wasn't in relation to this, so they did sever just that provision and find it unconstitutional. By a later act of the legislature, that language is no longer there. A different provision is in its place. So it is important when looking at changing the value that a particular group of property may be valued at, that we're still looking at the fair market value of the property. Let's see. The legislature may prescribe the manner in which certain properties shall be appraised in order to arrive at fair market value. Different factors or criteria relevant to a certain category of property may be considered when the goal remains achieving fair market value. So if you look at those list of factors in 79503A, you'll see over time there have been additional factors added because there has been some situation that has arisen that the legislature felt that factor needed to be taken into account when arriving at fair market value. But those factors are not, if you look at those factors, they are not necessarily related to the ownership of the property. They're related to the property itself and its fair market value. Also in the Constitution, you will find classification rates. We've talked about this, I think, or it's been mentioned, that these classifications where we have two classes of property, class 1 real property, class 2 personal property, and then we have different assessment rates depending on the subclasses that are provided. That was a constitutional amendment made in I believe it was an election in 1986 that took effect January 1st of 1989. And if you look at the attachment, you can actually see the subclasses. In real property, for example, we have the property used for residential purposes is assessed at 11.5%, ag land at 30%, vacant lots at 12%, and it goes on commercial, industrial, real property 25%, and then there's another category for our personal property. These are the assessment rates that are applied to the appraised values. So you have an appraised value, you multiply it by the assessment rate, you get the assessed value, which is then applied to the mill levy to arrive at a tax bill. In my mind, that again is one of the exceptions to uniformity, but it is provided in the Constitution. Not merely in a statute. Now there is, for your information, there is a statute that mirrors and provides more information related to this constitutional provision, 79-1439 and some other statutes. But it is, the classification structure is provided in the Constitution. So the next section I have is, I'll touch on this slightly because sometimes it's a question. Land devoted to agricultural use. There's a valuation methodology set out in statute for land devoted to agricultural use. And the authority for that ag use valuation is actually found in the Constitution. So if you look at Section 1 of the Constitution under the ag land classification, it does provide that land devoted to agricultural use, which shall be valued upon the basis of its agricultural income or agricultural productivity pursuant to Section 12 of Article 11. And then if you turn to Section 12, which I have a copy on the next page, Section 12 provides that land devoted to agricultural use may be defined by law and valued for ad valorem tax purposes upon the basis of its agricultural income or agricultural productivity. And then it goes on. But so the statutory authority for that agricultural use value methodology is found in the Constitution, and then the legislature has since then provided for that methodology and definition of ag land. The next topic I have that also touches on property tax, which we don't think about a lot, is in Article 11, and it's Section 5. And Section 5 is a short one-sentence section, and it provides that no tax shall be levied except in pursuant to a law, which shall distinctly state the object of the same, to which object only such tax shall be applied. This has also been litigated before our Kansas Supreme Court, and they found that this particular statement applies to property taxes, not excise taxes. So you'll see that there's a case that states that this particular provision doesn't preclude a tax levy statute from having more than one object. So you can have a general purpose for more than one object, so long as the legislature establishes a formula for the allocation of funds to each of the objects described in its levy. So you'll actually see, I have a case cited here, Schneider versus City of Topeka from 1980. And this had to do with the time shortly after the, I believe it was the possibly either in some of the tax increment financing provisions were first adopted. And so they ended up putting, if you read your statutes, you'll see a lot of references to those tax increment financing statutes, the bond and interest payments, and being able to use the property tax for those, for that purpose. And that's in response to this particular case that the object of the tax. So if you see that language in a myriad of statutes after that, this case is the reason why. The next topic I want to touch on just real briefly is exemptions. Exemptions are also discussed in the Constitution. The first, in Section 1 of Article 11, in subsection B, there is a provision for exemptions for all property used exclusively for state, county, municipal, literary, educational, scientific, religious, benevolent, and charitable purposes, farm machinery and equipment, merchants and manufacturers' inventories, other than public utility inventories, livestock and household goods and personal effects not used for the production of income, that those shall be exempt from property tax. So those are constitutional exemptions. In addition, there is an exemption in Section 13 of the Constitution that provides for some authority for cities and counties to provide exemptions for certain property for economic development purposes. And if you think back, I think I mentioned earlier that the power to tax lies with the legislature. And so the legislature would have the authority to, within the confines of the constitutional provisions, to provide statutory exemptions. But the legislature is the one that provides the exemptions, not other taxing entities. So a city or county doesn't have the authority to just make up its own property tax exemption, okay? It's bound by what the statute provides. And so this constitutional amendment, though, expands the authority and does provide the authority to the county and the city within these confines to provide this type of exemption. In addition, the legislature there is a provision in this Section 13 that provides that the legislature may limit or prohibit the application of that section to cities and counties. So the legislature still does have the power statutorily to limit this. And there are statutes out there that govern this particular exemption. Statutory exemptions, just real quickly, our Kansas Supreme Court has recognized that there is authority in our legislature has the authority to enact additional exemptions from property tax in addition to those found in the Constitution when the legislature has found that they have a public purpose and promote the general welfare. And on page 4 of your memo today, there's some cases that discuss constitutionally questionable statutory exemptions. And there has been a line of cases that has discussed what has to be considered or what elements to consider when evaluating a statutory exemption. It needs to further the public welfare, provide a substantial peculiar benefit. It needs to not provide for large accumulation of tax-exempt property. And it also, you need to evaluate whether the exemption is an improper or preferential classification of property. And there is a case out there that has found, at least in one case, an improper or preferential classification of property when there was a statute that provided an exemption for burial plots owned by individuals were exempt versus burial plots owned by corporations. And the court found that unlawfully discriminated against one citizen in favor of another, and struck down that particular exemption. Two notes, something we actually, I believe, discussed last week. The levies for the 1.5 mills for the Kansas Educational Building Fund and the State Institutions Building Fund. There is constitutional authority for those two permanent levies. So I've got them cited there in Article 6 and Article 7 that give the legislature the authority to make permanent levies for those two purposes. And I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Amelia. And just for the committee's information, a reminder, we were to have these presentations the Wednesday that we got canceled. So, but it's still timely. So thank you. Committee, any questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Committee, we'll turn our attention now to Eddie. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. You have in front of you in the folder associated with my presentation 4 documents. None of those are actually KLRD documents or my documents, but they're all documents that are relevant for, and I'm just going to kind of talk you through all of them. 2 of them are excerpted documents, and kind of the point here is to inform you of not only the underlying policies that you have as it relates to tax credits, sales tax exemptions and property tax exemptions, but also to inform you of the data and information that is available to you in documents that are already out there. Because it is not uncommon in this committee for bills to come before you and it to seem as though this is a novel policy. We don't have any idea about the fact that this policy is on the books, but in reality, if we just take a look at our regularly published publications that the Department of Revenue and the Property Valuation Division produce, they're actually right in there, and we can clear up a lot of that. And so the 4 items you have, and I'm going to mention these kind of in order that I'm going to go through them, are an excerpt from the Department of Revenue's most recent tax expenditure report, which says tax expenditure report on the front page, an Excel file that the Department of Revenue has regularly provided as it relates to tax credits in recent years, a memo that the Property Valuation Division maintains as it relates to Kansas property tax exemptions, and then an excerpt from the Property Valuation Division's most recent statistical report of property assessment and taxation. I'm going to go in the order of sales tax exemptions, income tax credits, and then the property tax exemptions at the end, and the last 2 documents I'll kind of speak from at the exact same time. So starting with the tax expenditure report, the second page of that has an important table, and that is the summary. And so this includes, the report in total includes more information than what I've provided you here today. It's available on the Department of Revenue's website under statistical reports. I can also send the link to John to distribute out to the full committee if that's easier for everybody. But you can see that the programs that are included within this report, you can see that on an annual basis, have $11.2 billion of tax expenditure by the state. And I'll talk a little bit more about it, exactly what goes into that. The 2 of these that I'm going to highlight specifically as we walk through all of these documents are the Kansas tax credits, which are the 3rd item listed, and the sales tax exemptions, which are the 4th item listed. And you can see there's $8.7 billion on sales tax exemptions, but I'll clarify on the second document why that's, or later on in this document, why that's a little bit of a misnomer. In terms of when you think of actual policymaking, it's correct in terms of the statistical analysis, but in terms of actually revisiting the sales tax policy, it's not really useful for practical policymaking. The others here are things that I'm not going to specifically cover today, but are included in that report. We can cover them at a different date if they're of interest to the committee, or if not, you can just review the report for them on your own. So jumping from there into the tables, this makes up pages 14 through 25 of the tax expenditure report, and these are published on an annual basis by the Department of Revenue. And these are the sales tax exemptions that exist in statute. And we oftentimes talk about how KSA 3606, I believe the bills that are currently being drafted enter into the fourth iteration of the alphabet in terms of subsections for that bill. Where we currently go through, I believe, ZZZ, and so the next sales tax exemption that might be enacted would be AAAA. Or we might not quite be there. We might be right on the cusp of that. This report, though, groups those not specifically by subsection. It actually groups them kind of more conceptually according to how those sales tax exemptions are oriented. And so the first grouping here that you have is the legal exemptions. And by legal exemptions, what they actually mean here is that these are kind of the ones that we think by law we have to have. That even if we didn't necessarily have these on the books, it might be difficult or impossible for the state to try to collect these sales taxes because of certain federal laws or the Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution. And so you can see that there's a little over $150 million in those. The next category that the heading for is on page 14, but then the bulk of the information for it is on page 15, is the single largest category. And this is one that I do want to spend just a little bit of time on. And that's because that's where the bulk of the money is. And this is conceptual exemptions. And this is when we talk about there's not really $8.7 billion to be had out of the sales tax exemptions. This is what we mean. These exemptions are really exemptions that are necessary for Kansas to have a true retail sales tax exemption. Otherwise, if we were to go into these exemptions and repeal them or adjust them to try to pull that money out, we could still call it the Kansas retail sales tax. But as a practical matter, it would basically amount to a value-added tax, which is, of course, the sort of tax that is used in other parts of the world. Nowhere in America is a value-added tax used, and it could have serious economic consequences if we were to try to be the only state to pivot to a value-added tax. If all 50 states got together and said, hey, let's revisit the way that we tax general excise and think, do we want to do the value-added thing as opposed to the retail, the end consumption, that wouldn't necessarily have the same sort of dramatic economic consequences. But if Kansas wanted to go down that road by itself, it would have all sorts of potential unseen implications in terms of incentivizing economic activity to not take place in the state of Kansas. And so that's kind of why, in some ways, those exemptions amount to a third rail as it relates to the sales tax exemption discussion, because they're really, while they are statutorily exemptions, as a practical matter, they're really just the nature of a retail sales tax to ensure that the place where the tax applies is the actual final retail transaction and not some sort of upstream transaction. The next category, and actually the next two, are two of the ones that people oftentimes think of when they think of sales tax exemptions, and specifically the concern of, are we picking winners and losers in our sales tax code? Do we not have a nice neutral application of that code? And do we basically government step into the economy by virtue of the sales tax exemption in a way that might be distortionary? Now, that's not to say that all of these are necessarily distortionary or all of these are non-neutral in their application, but this is what people tend to mean when they say that. And these are exemptions for various charitable organizations or religious or benevolent organizations, or various types of charitable or benevolent organizations. The first categories of these are ones where the legislature has written that in a way where it captures a group of those according to a specific legislative purpose. And then the second category, the second grouping of those, beginning on page 17 and extending over into pages 18, 19, and even 20, are actually the cases in our sales tax code where we specifically name entities, and those entities receive a sales tax exemption. And sometimes those entities are named very, very specifically, where it's almost a certain chapter or branch of an organization, and sometimes they're named in a bit more general fashion where any instance of that organization in the state is exempt from sales tax. But you can see that the generally applicable kind of public policy, charitable, religious, benevolent exemptions total up to almost $50 million. And the cases of those where they are named specifically by name total up to under $3 million throughout the state. And most of those are actually kind of confidential in nature, exactly what it is, because there are fewer than 5 taxpayers that are applicable to the subsection. You can see the very first one of those is 3606 VV, and there's a space added between the V's so that you can tell that it's not a W. That one actually lists more than 5 exempt organizations in the specific subsection, and so the department is able to provide a non-confident, or they're able to provide a specific estimate in a way that doesn't disclose taxpayer information in a way that wouldn't be allowed by statute. And that's probably actually something that it would be beneficial for me to pause and mention throughout all of these, especially the sales tax and income tax credit information. A number of the information will either be starred with 3 stars or have the letter C or the word confidential. Statutes prohibit the department from disclosing confidential information. The way the department has applied that is if the provision applies to fewer than 5 taxpayers, then any disclosure related to the amount of it or the number of taxpayers claiming it would be too revealing of potential taxpayer confidential information in that circumstance, and so you get it flagged confidential. There is a difference, though. You can see on page 17, 3606, TTT does not have 3 stars, it has a dash, and that is actually indicative that it's in fact not being used or not active. And so that's different than confidential. When it's 0 taxpayers, there's no confidential taxpayer information to avoid the disclosure of, and so it does get specified. And you'll see that also when we look at the income tax credits quite a bit as well. Moving on from there, you can see the next category of exemptions, and this begins on page 20 of the report, is what the department has kind of lumped together as consumer exemptions. This is one that has grown the most in recent years, and that is because one of the exemptions that is included in this report is the next to last one listed on page 20, 3603, subsection X, is the sales of food and food ingredients in accordance with 3603D. And so you can see that one, as of fiscal year 2024, was estimated to reduce state receipts by $460 million. And it's kind of a place where this has been faster growing. The next subsection is one that also sometimes has a little bit of confusion around you, and can we actually get this money, and what would be the implications of getting this money? And that is public policy for governmental exemptions. And you can see $1.7 billion in this. A little over $1.4 billion of that is 3606B, which is property or services purchased directly by, and then it lists things. The first of those is the state of Kansas. That's state government itself. The state makes a purchase, it doesn't pay sales tax. Political subdivisions of the state, which would include cities, counties, townships, other local governments, also don't pay sales tax. Within this same subsection, though, the legislature has lumped things that aren't actually governmental entities, but for ease of reporting have kind of been combined here, and that's nonprofit hospital, blood tissue organ bank, but type of sales. And the next thing you can see down there is the construction of school buildings. Also is a relatively large piece of sales tax exemptions. Separate from that, there are some exemptions for educational purposes that apply to educational institutions that are not limited to public institutions. And so you can see that as kind of the next category that we have here. As it relates to school districts, it's somewhat of a boot and suspenders situation. They could be exempt both pursuant to being a political subdivision of the state, but also pursuant to elementary and secondary schools. The next category here is just public policy decisions that the legislature has made as it relates to sales tax exemptions for healthcare type purchases. The very first thing there you can see and the largest category in this is sales of prescription drugs, almost $110 million there, and that makes up the bulk of this subset. The next category is public policy agricultural exemptions, and I want to highlight one of these because it speaks to kind of the inexact science of this categorization. Because the first thing listed there, 3606 Sales of farm or aquacultural machinery and equipment, parts and services for repair and replacement. This is one of those where you might be able to argue that that actually better fits into is this actually a retail sale sort of thing? Statutorily, it's got its own statutory subsection, and so for kind of grouping purposes, the department in this report splits it out, but this grouping, there's no law or rule directing how these groups are to be made, so it is somewhat of an inexact science. Next, we have a handful of services that are specifically exempt from sales tax, totaling about $6.5 million. In Kansas, we have a blanket application of the sales tax to the sale of goods generally, but we don't have a blanket application of the sales tax to sales of services. Rather, we have specifically delineated sales of services that are subject to the tax. I think it's about 15 or 17 subsections within 3603 that identify specific services to which the sales tax does apply. These are, in essence, carve-outs from those specific services. So these are things that would fit into a service that is otherwise subject to tax, but the legislature is elected to provide a specific statutory exemption or exclusion from that carve-out. The bill that you heard last week, as it relates to meat processing, kind of would fit into this same sort of category because of one of the services that's subject to the sales tax is the alteration of tangible personal property, and alteration is one of several words that is listed there. Maintenance, repair, alteration. I don't have the full list in front of me. So meat is tangible personal property. That alteration of them that happens when the meat is processed is what would make that subject to tax. Last year, the legislature enacted a sales tax exemption from them, and this the bill that you heard last week is moving that exemption to an exclusion in terms of its application. The next section is just kind of, in some ways, miscellaneous. It's by and large things that really just don't fit anywhere else, exemptions for businesses. And so you can see kind of the odds and ends that make up that category. I say odds and ends, but it does total about $550 million in total. And so that's how you kind of get to that grand total of sales tax exemptions of $8.7 billion. And this might be a good place to pause for questions, I think.
I'm afraid we're going to run out of time. I do want you to get to the property tax.
Okay, I can skip income tax credits and go straight to
Committee
property
will
tax.
come back to questions after the property tax.
Okay.
Thank you.
Property tax exemptions, you have in front of you two documents that I'm going to kind of speak from simultaneously. The first of those is the memo of property tax exemptions. And so there are lots and lots of property tax exemptions on the books. Sometimes when we discuss property tax exemptions, we think of only those that are kind of discretionary at the county level, the economic development exemptions that are provided for in the Kansas Constitution, as Amelia's document noted, but also then the industrial revenue bond exemption. And some of our reporting of the data speaks to specifically those. However, there are plenty of other property tax exemptions. We are sitting currently in a property that is exempt from property taxation. I happened to look up last night in preparation for this. I believe the appraised value of this building for 2024 was between $60 and $70 million, but of course none of that value went on the tax rolls because as state property used for state purposes, this is exempt property. And so you can see here that there is a fairly lengthy list of property tax exemptions. I failed to reach out to PVD to get an updated version of this memo. They probably do have one because there have been some changes since January of 2023. The most notable of those changes is on the first page, and so I'll highlight it for you, and it's the fourth one listed, and that's the exemption of a portion of residential value from the statewide school finance levy. At that point in time, the statute provided for that exemption to be $40,000 and then adjusted annually based upon a growth rate. And last year during the special session, you enacted legislation that provided for that exemption to be $75,000. I do think there are a couple of other tweaks. I don't think we've created any other ones, but I do think a couple of other exemptions have been statutorily altered since that point in
So
time.
Eddie, I think your graphic got cut off. The second column of counties is missing 2023.
Okay, yeah, on the table from page, from page 91. Yeah, it does look like it. I will follow up on that and get it will be easier in a PDF than sometimes these tables are not, in fact, 8.5 by 11 in the PDF, and so adjusting the document to that data can kind of get lost in there. So I'll get the PDF to the committee for that full information. But the report here basically splits the exempt property into 3 separate categories. 2 of those are the 2 that I specifically mentioned that are what sometimes get discussed in here. The ones that are discretionary or may not be uniform in their application across the state. And that's the constitutionally provided economic development exemption and the industrial revenue bond property tax exemption. And so you can see that for those, the amount of appraised value, and I want to emphasize appraised value, this isn't the assessed value, most of this in both cases would probably be commercial property, but there's no guarantee of that reality in these cases. The appraised value, of course, sitting between $2.6 and $2.7 billion statewide, and that's for the IRB exemption. You can see, of course, plenty of counties throughout the state don't use that exemption at all. And then flipping over to page 93 in the report, the table there, you can see the economic development exemption provided for in the Constitution had about $263 million of, once again, appraised value in 22. In 23, that had climbed up to closer to $311 million, $311 million of appraised value throughout the state that was exempt pursuant to that. However, I do want to highlight the table that is on page 91, and as Senator Tyson noted, it did cut off part of that table there, but you can see that there's $38.7 billion of valuation in 2022. This is from all of those statutory exemptions that are listed in the memo that apply uniformly throughout the state, but of course include things that maybe they include the things that might be, if Senate Bill 10 were to become law, those items would get lumped into this, and they would be that sort of thing, although this is actually just exempt real property. Exempt personal property with specific exceptions is not required to be listed, and so we don't actually have the appraised value of all of the exempt personal property throughout the state. And so it's probably worth highlighting that the amount of value that is exempt from tax pursuant to the statutory uniform statewide exemptions that have been provided by the legislature far exceed the amount of exempt value that have been provided by local county commissions over the years. And with that, I would stand for questions on the property tax exemptions as well.
So committee, we are about out of time. We'll go over questions and then we'll bring Eddie back for the last sheet, which I think is one of the most important ones, is the tax credit. Any questions on the sales tax or property tax exemptions? Senator Schallenberger.
Thank you. Just one. So the state is the only entity that can allow for a personal property exemption in a county.
I believe personal property can be and is exempted pursuant to both the constitutional economic development exemption and also pursuant to the industrial revenue bond exemption. And I think you can actually...
But a county can't decide that on their own they wanted to not charge for boats or...
Right, unless the boat was purchased with industrial revenue bonds, which is a pretty bizarre hypothetical, or the county made a determination related to the economic development.
But the economic development part, IRBs, things like that, that can be determined locally.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions, committee? Eddie, I do. The sales tax language, I know there was an attempt, was it last year or the year before, to try to bring uniformity to that? And where did that land? I know it was over on the House side.
There was a lot of discussion over it. I'm trying to recall if there even was a bill draft for that, or if it was just something that a number of legislators looked into and tried to arrive at a solution. I will review last year's subject index report and see if there was a bill draft.
Okay, thank you. I know it's been attempted, and we all agree we need to do something, but when you start digging into it, you realize what a beast it is. Committee, any other questions? Sales tax or property tax abatements? Senator Schallenberger.
Just one. Thank you very much. Is it possible to get a estimate, and I know it'd be a wild guess, of what a penny's worth of sales tax on services would be?
So what the Department of Revenue has been able to provide in the past is specific NAICS codes that they think would be captured by that, but the exact parameter of what would constitute a taxable service is squishy on that, I guess, especially without statutory language. And then the other thing that kind of makes it difficult is trying to assess which of those services might be otherwise subject to a sales tax exemption. Because of course, the sales tax exemptions in 3606, they don't limit it to, or by and large, they don't limit those purchases to tangible goods. There's of course maybe a few instances in which they do, and also they don't tend to say services in this case. So
Could you get us a squishy one?
yeah, we can provide some squishy numbers.
Just a penny and.
Yeah, and what it'll probably come in the form of a list of NAICS codes, and with an understanding that if there's something that would be taxable that doesn't fall into those NAICS codes, it would be basically omitted by that. But yeah.
Committee, any other questions? Seeing none, thank you. Committee, thank you, Eddie, for your work on this too. We will hear from Bob Kent tomorrow on property, an overview on property taxes, and hopefully we'll have time to work a bill, and we do have a hearing tomorrow, committee. I will get Eddie rescheduled because I think it's important to get these tax credits in front of the committee so that we see what we're looking at. Maybe consider some sunsets. Committee, is there any other business to be brought before us? Seeing none, we're adjourned.